Please join me in welcoming Walter Ungerer once again. Q&A. I guess first, see if any of you have any first questions or thoughts. Anybody? I'll warm you up first. Okay. I don't know whether to start more with technical, a few technical questions, or a few go into philosophical concerns. But well, I'll do the technical stuff first. So I'm curious on how your procedure, your technical procedure, has evolved over this time, because, well, for one thing, obviously you've gone from still photos back into actual shots with duration and so forth. But the window, let's first just talk about how your technique or what tools you're using and how that's evolved over time.
Well, I'm going to go even further back than that. I mean, I started out in 16mm film. That was the format that I used to learn filmmaking. At that time, there was no computer, there was no small digital cameras where I carry around here. There was just the film. I found one problem with working in the area of film is that it costs a lot of money. I tried whatever way I could to get grants or in some way get the money to make my films. Then video came into existence for me, and it was a camera and a separate recorder, two gadgets, and I noticed that as an alternative to film. Well, the advantage to that was that you had tape, and you could play the tape and replay it. You know, with film, it's a one-shot deal. You shoot the film, and if you don't like it, that's the end of it, pretty much. You know, I mean, you're not going to be able to film back in the camera and shoot another time. Whereas with video, you could re-record. Problem with the video was the quality was terrible compared to film. So I only used the video as a way of, if I worked, and at that particular time I'm talking about, as I transitioned to video, I worked with films that had some sort of storyline, and that involved getting people or actors and to test them, to sit down with them, and I used video as a way of recording them and then studying the tapes that I had created. Because video was not was not anything I wanted to work with, the quality was bad, I continued to use it simply as a tool to record for the purpose of reviewing actors or other, just even locations. Then the computer came into existence, and I, as in a way of equipment, I purchased an Amiga computer. And the Amiga was relatively inexpensive as computers go, and I thought it was fairly sophisticated in that I could do drawing with that. And that drawing was appealing to me because when I started out as a filmmaker, prior to being a filmmaker, I was a visual artist. That is, I went to a school in Brooklyn, New York called Pratt Institute. It was an art school, and I was seeing myself as a painter, basically a painter. So that physical painting was an experience I was able to duplicate to some extent using the computer. The computer program let me draw individual frames or sequences. The final result, when I completed the work using the computer and I projected it large, was not up to what I saw as the standard of film. Now, when I started out on film in 16mm, and searching what do I want to be as a filmmaker, what would I like to do with that, I was envisioning making 35mm films on a very large screen. And as I got into the computer and saw that the quality was poor, I still wanted to hold on to film. But the economy was getting worse for filmmakers, myself, a filmmaker that was wanting to survive as an independent, experimental filmmaker. And the drive to working with the computer continued simply because it was a lot cheaper than trying to make film, but it was not very satisfying because of the quality. And what began to happen is the quality of the computer got better, the quality of video got better, and at the same time my attitude to what is good quality also changed. So it changed to the point where, and I compared, I was thinking of Jackson Pollock or any of the more contemporary visual painters who would have drips of paint on their canvas or would do things that weren't so carefully composed. And I thought, that attitude is pretty good. It frees me up from having concern for these technical things, and it lets me enjoy the process and the making of the work. And so whatever began to develop in the way of the technology in computers and in video, it was something I accepted and more or less embraced. And so to some extent, whatever I then created with video or with the computer, I looked at it as something I could embellish on. I could develop it if it was squiggly lines and it didn't look like a photorealism. And it was a relief. Pretty much that's where I am today, is that, I shoot the last film I shot with a camera just like this. It just shoots sequences. Now the great thing about this little camera, or any, they're all like that, is that, and if I hold it down here and shoot, I record things that people don't notice I'm recording. And I know from time to time, even going way back as a filmmaker using a camera, there were times I would be walking around and noticing things that I thought would be interesting to record possibly for a film. But you got a big camera here and it only runs for 10 minutes. You've got to change magazines, and this thing runs for a long, long time. And so it was and still is very appealing. And that's where I am. I'm just, I'm most of the time using a very small camera such as this. Maybe I'm using also a mini DV camera to record. I have moved away from the story film that for a while, and you're not privy to any of that because the films that I showed you started about 1996, and for maybe 15 or so years I worked first creating a story, then getting the actors for it, and making 75 to 90-minute films, and doing it in a relatively traditional way, having to work with actors and a script of some sort. And there's something about the working with this equipment now that brings me closer to a real life than the pretend that I saw with working with actors. As far as the equipment, well, with the computer, started out with the Amiga. That company was in Pennsylvania. They are now defunct. They don't exist. I went to the Macintosh, and now I continue to work with a Macintosh camera, Macintosh computer, and small format cameras.